Hello. Today I have the honor of interviewing Dr. Jennifer Leigh. As part of Physicians for Human Rights, Dr. Leigh is a Myanmar research consultant studying health consequences of the Myanmar coup and violence against the Rohingya in the Northern Rakhine State. She's also a humanitarian health expert for international business and technical consultants. With a master's in global health and a doctoral degree in public health studies, Dr. Leigh is an expert with over 2 decades of experience in global and humanitarian health, concentrating on accountability in humanitarian aid and community-based healthcare for displaced populations. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Leigh. So to start off, I'm really fascinated by your work in advocacy in Bangladesh. Could you describe in more detail what your job entails as a Myanmar research consultant?
Sure. Yeah, so there are 2 key facets, and one is, as you mentioned in the intro, researching the health consequences of the coup that started on February 1st of this year. So we're specifically looking at the attacks against health facilities and healthcare workers perpetrated by the military junta. We're also looking at excessive use of force against protesters and injury or death of individuals in detention, and using forensic investigation and evaluation techniques. And we're doing a joint research project on some of the larger impacts on the public health system with Johns Hopkins University. The other component of my work is with the Rohingya. So for the past 3 years, Physicians for Human Rights has been doing, well, 3 and almost 4 now, has been doing research and information gathering with displaced Rohingya in Bangladesh in the camps around Cox's Bazar. So I've worked in some of that data collection, and we're currently working on sharing that data with accountability mechanisms and using it to for awareness raising and advocacy purposes, sharing it with the US State Department and other relevant parties.
So I see there's a lot of collaboration. What first got you interested in this field?
Well, my initial intention was to be a physician. I think that was, when I was younger, the only way that I knew of to do health work. While at university, I came to understand more about public health, and it seemed a great way to combine my interest in health and my interest in infectious disease, my interest in social justice. And so I started exploring ways to work in public health. And I quickly realized that, I was really interested in working internationally and was drawn to working in humanitarian settings. So I built up a skill set that would enable me to both implement programs and do research and evaluations in those kinds of settings. And along the way, I met a group of people at Johns Hopkins who are using epidemiologic methods to document human rights violations. And I found that extremely interesting and an excellent way to use an established tool set to build up a strong evidence base. So that has become part of my work as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. In 2019, you published a research article in The Lancet titled Violence and Mortality in the Northern Rakhine State of Myanmar. Can you tell me more about these findings?
Yes, so that was a study we conducted with Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. It was focusing on interviews with the leadership of hamlets in Northern Rakhine State, so village leaders and village elders who in the system in Myanmar were responsible for reporting on population numbers within their village. So they had a pretty good sense of the numbers, who was living there. And as they transferred to the camps, they were also re-networking and keeping track of who had made it to Bangladesh. So we interviewed those individuals to get an understanding about what happened to their hamlet as a whole. And we interviewed individuals from nearly 600 villages, which is almost all of the villages in Northern Rakhine State with Rohingya inhabitants. And what we found were the attacks were very widespread across Northern Rakhine State in all 3 townships. The attacks were very centered and coordinated around August 25th, a specific date, which suggested a very coordinated and premeditated attack. And 94% of respondents reported that there had been some kind of destruction or violence in their hamlet, including the burning of fields and farms, homes and mosques, and over 90% reported violence against individuals in their hamlet before they fled to Bangladesh. with an additional 2/3 reporting violence against civilians during their flight to Bangladesh. So it was very widespread violence. And quite a few of respondents reported the participation of military vehicles and resources in these attacks, including 77% reporting having sighted military helicopters, 70% reporting military vehicles, and 21% reported even seeing tanks. And ultimately, we estimated, based on their intelligence, the number of Rohingya who died from both violent and indirectly nonviolent causes associated with the August 2017 attacks as 7,800 individuals, which was in line with similar estimates that had been put out by MSF.
From your study, what do you believe is the biggest limitation?
Well, it's always difficult to conduct research in a humanitarian setting. This was a population that was newly arrived in Bangladesh. They were still in flux, establishing households within the camps. So there was movement of people. People were still getting reconnected. So that was one challenge. I think there was also a lot of trauma in the camps. I mean, people had gone through a very harrowing experience, having witnessed and experienced violence and seen widespread violence and destruction. And so us asking about it poses a risk of reliving that trauma, or even secondary or vicarious trauma to the surveyors and data collectors. So we tried to be extremely careful and mindful about that risk and make sure that we had resources in place to be able to provide mental health support, or to be able to alleviate and minimize those risks as much as we could. We had made the decision to speak with village leadership because we wanted to encapsulate the experience of the village as a whole. And in Northern Rakhine State, that by default means that we are speaking to all men. But as a consequence of that, we perhaps lost some of the perspective of women. It was a decision that we made, but we recognized that, maybe we undercounted sexual violence or some other kinds of crimes as a result. And I think one of the other challenges that we faced was with the Rohingya language, which does not currently have a written form. So it was quite challenging to figure out the best way to administer a standardized survey when you don't have a written form of the dominant language. So we worked with our survey team and some interpreters to develop a transliteration system, because there's also no standard transliteration system into either Burmese, Arabic, or English scripts. So we worked with our team to develop a transliteration so that we could create a pidgin written form of Rohingya so that the surveyors could conduct the survey in Rohingya in a standardized way. So yes, these were some of the challenges. Some of them led to limitations. Some of them we tried to mitigate.
Mm-hmm. And would you also say that there were a lot of technical difficulties?
There were some. I mean, we were using tablets to enter data, which require a mobile uplink periodically to sync the data and send it to the server. There's not widespread internet connections in the camp, and the mobile network is spotty. So that was challenging. There's also not widespread electric grids in the camp. So we were relying on the solar electric supply that was available, which meant that, sometimes it was easier to charge up tablets or power banks than other times. So yeah, those were definitely challenges, but I think those weren't unexpected. Those are common challenges working in humanitarian settings. So we had anticipated and planned for some of that. And we actually bought some of our own solar panels so that we weren't inconveniencing others in the camp who relied on the limited power that is produced by a single panel.
Mm-hmm. I see. And so most of the attacks against the Rohingya citizens are attributed to the border guard police and the Tatmadaw. Mm-hmm. So do you encounter these groups in your work often?
Well, this research was all conducted in Bangladesh. So those entities were not in Bangladesh. They couldn't cross the border. That said, they did have a presence at the border, and people trying to go back or, continue crossing into Bangladesh did have encounters. And even while I was there, people continued to be shot and injured. Directly, I did not interact with them in the course of this research. In prior research that I've conducted inside Myanmar, I've had other encounters with Burmese authorities, but not in the context of this research.
Mm-hmm. So when you have interacted with them, how did you personally interact with the Myanmar authorities?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, it depends very much on the context. I did work in Eastern Myanmar, working with some community-based health organizations and ethnic health organizations. And part of what my organization was trying to do in that context was create space for the voices of those organizations to be heard at the level, say, of the Ministry of Health. The ministry did not have extensive health networks or resources in those border areas. So the community organizations were the only ones providing extensive services or collecting data. And we were trying to enable their knowledge and their data to be taken into account by the Ministry of Health. So I think it depends a lot on the context. In the context of this research, even though I didn't work with the Myanmar authorities directly, we were quite cognizant that the information that we released publicly would be accessible by them. And so it was extremely important to us that we take very careful steps to protect all of our respondents and our surveyors. We had valid concerns that if the Myanmar authorities became aware of who was participating with us, there could be retaliation against them when they were repatriated to Myanmar or against their family who still remained in Myanmar. So that's something we're always very aware of. Similarly, when we share information with accountability mechanisms, it's very important to know what of that information will be shared with Myanmar or with the defense, so that we know what we need to do to best protect our respondents and our partners.
Yeah, so it's really important to keep all the identifiable information confidential. And
yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
And could you tell me a little bit about the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army and the Rakhine extremists, and if you have encountered them?
Well, the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, which is known as ARSA, is itself an extremist group within Northern Rakhine State. It was blamed for the attacks on August 25th that led to or were associated with the Myanmar counterattack in August of that year. I don't have a lot of direct experience with them, so I can't speak necessarily to the veracity of that. I do know that they are even currently a presence in the refugee camps in Bangladesh, and they're a very conservative and stringent extremist group, and they've caused a lot of tension within the camps. They have strong feelings about women participating in the workforce, about some cultural norms, and there's been violence and threats against families that don't comply with their views. So I do know it's definitely a point of tension. And similarly, back in Rakhine State, I mean, a lot of the arrests and violence that happened even before August 2017 were because the Myanmar authorities were accusing individuals of being affiliated with ARSA or harboring ARSA, whether or not that was true. So they've definitely been an excuse, rightly or not. They're frequently cited by Myanmar authorities as a reason for the violence. Yeah.
And so related to that, your article also notes how Myanmar authorities have failed to conduct a comprehensive investigation into the violence perpetuated against the Rohingya, and they're unwilling to cooperate with others. So could you tell me a little bit more about this dynamic?
Yeah, so Myanmar did establish a panel of inquiry to look into what happened in Rakhine State, but the panel, included on it members of the government who already had expressed anti-Rohingya views. And so it definitely seemed from the beginning that it wasn't going to be fully objective. And the findings from it were not matching with the preponderance of international evidence that had been collected. So it's perceived as being an inadequate, summarization of what occurred in Rakhine State. I think there's been extensive evidence collection by groups besides, in addition to Physicians for Human Rights, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and Reuters and the UN's investigative mechanism for Myanmar. that have found, extensive documentation of the violence. So Myanmar's attempt to address their part in the Rohingya crisis via that panel, I think, was entirely unsatisfactory. Now there's a court in the International Court of Justice that was brought, a case that was brought by the Gambia, and the government's response to that has been disappointing as well. I think right now we're in an unusual situation in that because of the coup, there's some question about what is the legitimate government of Myanmar? Is it the junta? Is it the National Unity Government, which is asserting its authority? So the court is kind of in a stasis situation while they try to figure out what authority to recognize in Myanmar, which means that accountability is also on hold, as it were.
So this unstable government can also translate to lack of action.
Yeah, I definitely think that it's, slowing things down with other accountability mechanisms as well. And I think there's also a question about the National Unity Government, which is the main opposition body to the junta at the moment, the main political opposition. It doesn't want to associate itself with the crimes of the prior government, but at the same time, if it's not willing to engage in accountability mechanisms, then, we may lose the chance for accountability for those crimes, even if they weren't the individuals that perpetrated it. There still needs to be space to pursue accountability. So that's something, the outcome of this coup and what's happening in Myanmar will certainly affect accountability for the current actions and also those against the Rohingya.
And so what's the current relationship between Physicians for Human Rights, the military, and the government? How do you guys work together?
Well, we don't. Physicians for Human Rights does not currently have anyone on the ground in Myanmar. So our current work is all through partners. We have, extensive partnerships across the country with different groups and individuals, but we have no staff on the ground. I think, PHR has been fairly public about its criticism of the current actions in Myanmar and prior violence as well, both violence in ethnic areas. I mean, we've put out reports in the past about violence in Eastern Myanmar and Chin State against the Rohingya, and now against the civilians in Central Myanmar as well. I think we've been fairly public in our criticisms and our calls for them to cease their attacks on health and allow for the aid that is needed. So in terms of how they view us, I don't really care. We don't work with them directly, and I don't think that we would be able to, but I think there's a need for some organizations to raise their voice, because there are others that are working in the country that have to be slightly more circumspect in order to maintain their access. So that's a role that we can play.
In the future, do you think this hurdle to collaboration could be overcome?
Well, I think yes. I mean, looking at the past, we see that in 2010, when Myanmar started to open and democratize, although it was a slow process and it didn't democratize overnight, there were inroads that were possible after that time. And that's certainly the space that I mentioned earlier in terms of trying to bring, data and connections from the ethnic border areas into the Ministry of Health and making those connections. And I think there was a lot of work with the Ministry of Health, even at that time, before the NLD was elected in 2015, to start more dialogue and more capacity building and more partnership. And progress was made. I think that's being eroded currently in the context of the coup. And it's hard to say what's going to happen in Myanmar, in the next near-term future. Unfortunately, I'm very sad to see what's happening in the country. And I think, unfortunately, it's a long road back to stability for them. But yes, I don't think that you need to find ways to cooperate with institutions that are, fundamentally unwilling to work with partners, or that are enacting gross violations of human rights or other international crimes. But I think, you know, we will seek for opportunities in the future as they become possible and are appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that you mentioned in the article was that Rohingya leaders regularly met with military personnel and or members of the border guard police and the immigration department who threatened the Rohingya. So could you explain more about the national verification cards and why many Rohingya refuse to participate?
Right. So a central tenet of the conflict in Northern Rakhine State was about recognizing the Rohingya as citizens. And previously, the Rohingya were recognized as citizens, although that is, you know, being refuted currently by some officials in Myanmar. But, you know, there were individuals in the 50s and 60s who had citizenship cards. And over the last several decades, that has changed and they've been stripped of those citizenship rights. It usually is pointed to the 1982 citizenship law, which listed about 160 ethnicities who were native to Myanmar. And if you didn't make it on that list, you were considered, you know, like a foreign or an illegal alien, and the Rohingya were not included on that 1982 or 1982 list. That's given as the basis for stripping them of their citizenship rights. The National Verification Card is an attempt to legally brand them as illegal aliens by giving them a card that is an identity card, but it is different than the identity card that is given to Myanmar citizens. And the card refuses to acknowledge their ethnicity as Rohingya. It refers to them as Bengali and as foreign nationals. So the fight over accepting them is the government is forcing them to take this card in order to access government services, in order to have, you know, movement in schools and education and jobs, et cetera. But the Rohingya don't want to accept a card that denies their existence, denies their history in the country, and denies their citizenship. So before August 2017, there were a series of meetings where the border guard, police and the immigration authorities were meeting with villages, trying to convince them by threat or by force to accept the NVCs. And that was a lot of the tension in the lead up to the violence in August 2017. And that's still a point of contention, actually. I mean, even with the new national unity government, there's question about whether the Rohingya will be accepted as citizens by law or by right. And the NRG has put out a statement saying they'll recognize citizenship for the Rohingya, but there's still a question, is it because they're being given an exception, or is it because their ethnicity is accepted as a native ethnicity in Myanmar? So that's still a point of an unresolved issue.
I see that the debate on the citizenship for the Rohingya is very controversial and a heavy topic. So also when you're interacting with the Rohingya and interviewing them at the refugee camps, what's your personal reaction?
Well, I mean, even before they were displaced to Bangladesh, experienced oppression in their home area. You know, they weren't allowed to own land. They had to have permission to marry. They weren't allowed to have more than 2 children. They weren't allowed to, you know, get government appointments. They couldn't get a diploma saying they graduated from university. There were an extreme number of restrictions on them even before they arrived in Bangladesh. They've been living as already one of the most oppressed groups. And then they were forced out of their homes by violence and by destruction. And they arrived in a refugee camp where they were reduced to, you know, making a shelter out of some bamboo poles and tarpaulins. And it's a lot. I think it's hard not to be with them and not appreciate the heartbreak of their situation, but at the same time recognize the strength that they have in organizing their community. You know, this is a community that knows what it wants and it's asking for it publicly. And when the Bangladesh government and the UN and the government of Myanmar were negotiating repatriation, the Rohingya stood up and said, we have not been included in these conversations. Here's our request. Here's what we need to feel safe to go home, which is what they want, but they want to make sure that they're not walking into a situation that will just lead to a repeat. So I have a lot of respect for the community. Obviously, it's a diverse community. I mean, there's a lot of perspectives and differences in the community, but I think it's a community that has been through a lot, but also has a lot of strength. And You know, I mean, I've developed close relationships working with a number of individuals in the camps through this research and through other research that I've conducted. And, you know, we still stay in touch and talk regularly. Yeah, so I, you know, definitely consider them my friends as well.
I agree. I think the Rohingya community is very resilient. Another thing is that I find your large-scale research efforts very unique because they include systematically gathered mortality data and information on perpetrators that a lot of other research papers exclude. So in the long term, what do you hope to achieve with your findings?
Well, you know, I think as with any human rights violation documentation, the hope is to, one, raise awareness, and two, contribute in some way towards accountability and justice. We try to bring the methods that we use to human rights documentation because a lot of the traditional methods rely on individual interviews or testimonies, which are extremely valuable, but we wanted to be able to collect some population data to provide some more, you know, representative information or some larger scale data collection. And so that's what I think is a unique strength to some of the work that, you know, that we've worked on in this setting and in many other settings. I hope that this information can be used to, you know, definitively refute the claims of the government that this violence didn't occur or that it wasn't widespread or systematic. I hope that it can contribute to accountability mechanisms like the ICC and the ICJ and the IIMM. And I hope that it can contribute to other determinations like the current ongoing Department of State's determination of whether the events in August 2017 constituted a genocide.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate the insight you've provided today on global and humanitarian health in Myanmar and Bangladesh. And I gained a more interpersonal look on this issue and learned more about the disparities that the Rohingya face, and especially issues on citizenship. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer my questions and attend this interview. I really learned a lot, and I appreciate this opportunity.
Enjoy speaking with you, and good luck.
Thank you so much.